Tonight, we're going to go through another aspect of covenant. Starting next week, though, after we finish all of this symbology and these different passages that we've been looking at about cutting covenant and dying to self and all of those kind of things, we're going to actually start looking at the three different covenants and how they interact with one another, how they apply to our lives, and all of those kind of things. So we only have, after tonight, 4 more lessons. Can you believe it? No, that went fast, didn't it? It was just like, it's like, yeah. So what I want to let you know, too, is that I am going to be ordering the workbooks for Luke before we break. Unless I hear from you, if you have a workbook, I'm going to order you the same workbook that you have now, unless you tell me that you don't want a workbook or that you want a different one. And what we'll do is I'll hand them out the last night of covenant, and when we come back after the first of the year, we will all be ready to start on lesson 1 of Luke. Sound good? Years ago. Mm-hmm. All right, so if you have any workbook change, though, let me know within the next 10 days, because I'm going to be ordering the workbooks. Okay, so before we get started, let's do a little bit of review. So if someone, or you were to go to lunch with someone or have coffee with someone, and they said, hey, I know you do that Bible study on Thursday night, and what are you doing? And you said, well, we're doing a study of covenant. And they said to you, what is that? How would you explain that? So we're talking about the binding agreements that we see in the Bible and the assurance that those binding agreements can give to us, right? So what is a covenant? A binding agreement, right? To read the word in the Bible, to make a covenant implies that what happened when that covenant was made. The blood was shed somehow for that agreement to be made, whether it's the blood of the individuals who are going into the covenant or an animal sacrifice. But remember, the word made is karef in the Hebrew, and it means to actually cut. And it means, so when you cut a covenant, you walk through the pieces of the flesh, right? And so what we have been looking at are these different things that we see. The covenant entails the changing of identities, right? We saw that with David and Jonathan. We're going to look at that some more tonight. It also entails a oneness, right, that we looked at last week with the understanding of the sharing of blood and that life, that you share a life in common now. We also saw, though, that in covenant, this understanding is that walk of death, that you walk through those pieces and you die to yourself, but you live in a Christian's life. With the new covenant, you live to who? You live to Christ. So that idea of dying to self and to live for your covenant partner, right? So these are all the things that we've been looking at. So we've looked at what does it mean to die to self. We've looked at last week what it means to share a common life with our covenant partner. And tonight, what we're going to look at is that when you come into covenant, can you expect, or is there an expectation that you will withhold nothing from your covenant partner?
We will not withhold anything.
You will not
Because that
withhold
question was kind of
anything.
Yeah.
Okay, I know, it was kind of circular. I was seeing if you were awake. You passed.
Good job.
Yeah.
It
So,
takes money.
okay. So what I want you to do is turn over to Genesis 17. We're going to spend some time here again tonight. Remember I told you a couple of weeks ago that there are a few passages in Genesis that when we're done, you're going to know really, really well. And Genesis 17 is one of them. Now remember, in the beginning of Abram's life, we see in Genesis chapter 12 that he's living in a foreign country. He's living in Ur. At some point in time, while he's there, God comes to him and he tells him to go to a land that he will show him. And if he will do that, that God will make him a great nation. He will give him descendants. He will make his family a blessing to all of the families in the world. And he will give him the land that he is taking him to, right? Then what we see is that between Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, we see that there are no descendants that are born. We see that they get to the land, and the land is inhabited by a lot of different tribes and people groups. And we see that because there isn't a child that has been born to Abram yet as a descendant, in Genesis 15, Abram decides that he's going to have the steward of his household, Eleazar, become his heir, right? And what does God say about that?
No, he's going to come from your own
No,
loins.
he's going to come from your own person, and he takes him out, remember in Genesis 15:5, and he says, look at the stars. He says, and if you can count them, he goes, so shall your descendants be. And in the next verse, it says that, what does Abram do at that moment?
He believes him, and then God credits him as
He
righteousness.
believes God, right? Now, what does it mean to believe in that passage? In a biblical sense of belief, what does it mean?
Trust.
Okay, so you trust, or you have a full confidence in this person that they're going to do what they're going to say, and because of your trust, it changes you, right? It changes your behavior. Biblical belief, in this sense, always has a corresponding behavior change to what you say that you believe intellectually, right? So what we see is that at that moment, now remember, Abram and God have been talking a lot since he left, all right? We've had a lot of experiences that they've gone through, but at that moment, Abram believes that God can be trusted, and his behavior then from that moment corresponds to that belief. And God says at that moment, in response to Abram's belief, that Abram is what? Righteous. He has right standing then before God. He is willing to conform to the things of God, right? But what we see, though, is that there's still this question about the land. So as the passage goes on, what does God tell Abram to do?
Walk it.
Remember, he tells him to bring the animals, right? To cut the animals in half and lay them out. And then what we see is that Abraham, he has a vision, and in that vision, God discloses to him all that's going to happen to his descendants, in a sense, right? Now, remember last week we were talking about that Abraham is described as a friend of God, and in the Hebrew, the word friend there means an intimate relationship, right? So what we see as a friend talking to a friend, what God does in Genesis 15, at the end of that, he tells him, okay, you're going to die at a good old age, but your descendants at some point in time are going to go to a foreign land, and they're going to be what in that land?
Enslaved.
They're going to be enslaved in that land. They're going to be enslaved for 400 years, because the time the sin of the Amalekite is not yet complete. But at the end of that time, I'm going to bring them back, and I'm going to bring them back where? To this land, right? And then we see that after God finishes disclosing all of this, we see the smoking torch and the smoking oven and the flaming torch. And in the next verse it says, and God made a covenant with Abram, that God passed through the pieces of that flesh to make that binding agreement between he and Abram.
So,
right?
so just a quick question for you, because I think about this a lot, and I don't still know that I really understand it, and it's not addressed that I'm aware of. What's the symbology of the flaming torch and the smoking
We
oven?
don't know.
And what the heck is a smoking oven or whatever it is?
Smoking fire pot.
Yeah,
Okay, so fire pot, and what was the other thing?
a flaming torch.
Yeah, smoking fire.
We don't know what
is
they
that?
symbolize, but it's interesting because the same imagery is used in Zechariah. And it has to do with, in Zechariah, it has to do with the ability of Jerusalem to become the hand of God's judgment on the nations around them. So I don't know what it means. We're not, to my knowledge, nowhere in the Bible is there a legend that says, okay, smoking fire pot equals this. But what you do see is that it always has something to do, anyway, point in the passage in Zechariah about the judgment of God. So maybe it has something to do with the judgment that his sons will be on those who are living in the land. But we're not told in the passages, so anything that we come up with is purely speculation. But we know that they represent who?
God.
That we know that they represent God. But we're not told exactly how they represent God.
So, I mean, in my mind, I've got this picture of this smoky pot like you see in a Catholic church, right? I mean, like on a chain deal, but I don't know what it is. But just walking through invisibly, like an invisible God is walking that through the stuff. I mean, that's kind of what the passage leads me to believe. It's just, I mean, how, 5-6 feet above the ground, just walking. I don't know, but it's a curious thing to think about.
It is a curious thing to think about, but what we know is that these two things represent God in the Zechariah passage, and they represent God in the passage in Genesis.
Was it a flame by night and a
Cloud by day. Yeah. So, yeah. But how we know, see, and I think that if we didn't have the next verse in Genesis 15, it would be open to speculation what had happened, but in the next verse after that then the next verse says, I think it's Genesis 15:17, or something like that, it says, and God made a covenant with Abraham at that time.
Yeah, 15, 18.
Okay? So we know that those two things symbolize God passing through the flesh. Now, the question is, as we get to chapter 17 now, is that can you be in relationship with someone without the person you're in relationship with at some point in time, expecting something from you? Are relationships two-sided?
Yes.
Are they reciprocal?
Yes.
And yes. See, and I think this is what's important when you look at our relationship with God. There are things that God, he may go along for a while, and he's doing maybe all the heavy lifting for a while, and then all of a sudden he pops up and he says, okay, guess what? It's time for you to do something.
Exactly.
Right? And this is exactly now what we see in Genesis 17. Right? Now, between Genesis 15 and Genesis 17, we have the birth of Ishmael, right? Because in 15, he's told that he's going to have a child from his own body. And we have to remember that Sarah is what? She's barren, right? And so having a child through Hagar seems to be the logical answer to the problem of descendants, right? So in verse 1 of chapter 17, it says, now when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. And I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly, right? The name for God here that is used is El Shaddai, so I am God Almighty. And then he goes on and he says to him, and then it says in verse 3, Abram fell on his face, and God, Elohim, the one true God, right, as the interpretation of Elohim here, talked with him saying, right? So now we have this conversation again between these friends. He says, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. And this is one of the things that you saw in your homework last week, that many times part of covenant was taking on the name of your covenant partner. So Abram's now, his name is changed by God from Abram to Abraham. And many theologians and linguists believe that the sound that is now put into his name is part of God's very own name, right? So he's now identified as a covenant partner with God. Even when you call his name, you have a different name now. It's not Abram, now it's Abraham, right? And God is in the business of changing people's names. Jacob's name goes from Jacob to Israel. We see that Peter's name is changed from Cephas to Peter. We see Saul, he starts using his Greek name Paul. But there's this idea that within covenant, it's like when Ken and I got married, like I was talking about last week, I cease to be Lorena Whitaker, except every once in a while, for whatever reason, I'll be signing a check and I look down and it says Lorena Whitaker, and I'm like, holy smoke, that person hasn't existed for a long time. You know?
You mean Lorena
See,
Akins?
I mean Lorena Akins, yeah. And I'm just like, Lorena Akins, she hasn't been here for 40 years. See, that when I covenanted with Ken, part of the agreement was that I would take on his name, right? And this is what we see happening with Abram. He's no longer Abram, he's Abraham. And God changes his name as his covenant partner. Then he goes on and he says, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. So how long is this agreement between Abraham and who? And God. But who else is part of the agreement? His descendants, right? And what is the time frame on the covenant? It is everlasting. Now, the word Hebrew and the word everlasting in Hebrew is defined as a hidden time, right? It is a time frame of which the end is not defined, right? So God doesn't say that there's a time frame in which this covenant will ever end, right? It's an undefined time frame in this. And he says that in this everlasting covenant that he is making between the two of them, he says that I will be God to you and to your descendants after you, right? So what is the understanding will be the response, a continued response on Abraham's part, but on his descendants' part as well within this covenant.
That he will continue to be God to the descendants.
That he will continue to be God to the descendants. Right? Now, we know the story. How well did that go? It didn't go very well. Right? But it was this understanding that the relationship that God had with Abram would go on and be passed to his descendants generation after generation. Right? So, he goes on and he says that I will be God to you and to your descendants after you. I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, as a what? Everlasting possession, and I will be what? I will be their God. Right? Now, I think what's interesting is that what you see here is an understanding, and we're going to look at this when we get to the Mosaic covenant as well, but they're having the land and living in that land as their possession has a stipulation built in the Abrahamic covenant that will be further clarified in the Mosaic covenant. And the stipulation of them living in the land is that they will have the land as long as their relationship with who is what it's supposed to be, with God. Right? Now, this brings up a lot of questions that we're going to start looking at in a couple of weeks with the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant. But this isn't something that God says, this thing that's happening between you and I, Abram, this is just a one-time thing. The understanding on God's part is that it will go from generation to generation to generation. And then, what God says in verse 9, he says, God said further to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be what? Circumcised. He says, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant. Right? So when you look at this, remember last week we were talking about that many times when a covenant cut was made, that they would make it so it would scar, so they would have a memory of the covenant that they made with someone. And we looked at this, that on Jesus' own person, what does he have now? the scars of the covenant, right? In his palms and in his side and in his feet. And so now, what God is saying to Abram is that you and your descendants after you, the males of your line, will bear on their body a scar, in a sense, a mark, right? And the mark that it's going to be is the mark of circumcision, and it is tied to their possession and their covenant relationship with who? With God, right? Now, one of the things I think is really interesting is that God takes this sign of the covenant really seriously, right? Because he says to them after this, he says, "And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations." So whose responsibility is it to bring these boys into the covenant?
Their fathers.
It's their father, it's their family's responsibility, it's the community's responsibility, right? Of their family to bring them into the covenant. What's interesting is the boys don't have any say over it, right? So what we see here is that this is something that is done for them at this age to bring them into the community of the descendants of Abraham, right? Now, what happens if a child is not circumcised, or if a male that is part of the family of Abraham isn't circumcised at this time?
Cut off from the people.
He's cut off,
What's
right?
that mean exactly? I mean, so you're Joe family living in the, with the people, with your group, and you decide you're not going to circumcise your son. Do you, Dave, I imagine that they would have some kind of a ceremony so people would probably know, right? But if, whether they did or didn't, what's that cut off thing mean? They gotta move away, or they just ignore them and shun them, or what's that look like?
It actually, the phrase means to be removed from. So it can be through shunning, it can be a physical leaving. Okay, I think, now this is one of those things that I'm still processing here. So, video land, don't be sharing this and saying, "Oh, Lorena said this," okay? Even though I'm gonna say something, I'm processing. Okay, what's interesting about this is the sign of circumcision goes through the line of Abraham for those who are going to inherit the promises of Abraham, right? And what we're going to see as the passage goes on is that Sarah then is identified as the mother, right? So what we see is that the covenant that God makes with Abraham, by extension, is given to Sarah as well. Her name is changed. She's told that she's going to bear this child. And God is very specific that the covenant promises will only go through Isaac, right? He will be the one who gets the covenant after Abram dies. His son Jacob will then. So what you see is there is a distinct line of descendants that receive the covenant promises of God. Not every one of Abraham's sons would receive the covenant promises. Ishmael, even though he is circumcised as part of the household of Abraham, he doesn't get any of the covenant promises. What's interesting is that then after Sarah dies, Abraham marries Keturah and produces 6 more sons. And in the next verse in Genesis 25, it says, "And his concubines produced children." So what you see here is that Abraham, after Sarah dies, he has a lot of other children, and in the text it reads that when he died, before he died, he gave his other sons gifts and sent them away from Isaac, but Isaac inherited all that was Abraham's. So the question that we have here, I think that's an interesting question to kind of ponder, is the sign of covenant, or the sign of circumcision, only for those who would be part of the Abrahamic covenant, who would receive those promises? And over time, was the sign of circumcision corrupted?
Well, yeah, it had to have been, based on the way that God responded to Moses, and they already were taking it easy.
Okay, but
right?
see, but was it corrupted by overuse? See, did Midian, even though when Midian comes along as one of the sons of Keturah, Midian was circumcised as Abram's son, but was it intended that Midian would circumcise his sons in his line? Was it understood that even though Ishmael had been circumcised as part of the house of Abraham, would Ishmael continue to circumcise his sons? Because what do we know about Ishmael particularly? Are we told very clearly about Ishmael? He was not going to inherit what the true heir would inherit. And this is what you see in Genesis when Isaac is born, and there's the weaning feast, and Ishmael is teasing Isaac, remember? And what does Sarah say?
Get rid of him.
Get rid of him, okay? And Abraham goes and he asks God, and God, what does God say? Do what Sarah tells you to do, right? And we think that's such a harsh statement if you don't know that God has already promised Abraham that Ishmael will become a great nation. Nothing's going to happen to Ishmael when they're out there. God's promised to make him a great nation. The 12 princes will come out of him, that he will live in the land of Arabia. But what God tells him is that your covenant promises will be given to you or will be passed on to Isaac, right? And so the sign of the covenant here in Genesis 17 was supposed to be, it seems, a physical reminder of the descendants of Abraham, that they would inherit the land, that they would be a blessing to all of the nations, and this would be something that was passed from generation to generation to generation. Because God says it's the sign of the covenant, and the covenant only extends to certain people and is passed down through certain people.
But in verse 12 it says, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. You know, that's part of the circumcision.
Right, and once they came into Abram's household, they became part of the covenant because Abram was the covenant. But did that mean that if that slave bought their freedom back, that he would continue circumcision? See, this is the question I think that's interesting about this, because what you see later on is that circumcision is used as a tool of deception with Jacob and his sons, with the situation with Dinah, that they say, to be part of us, you have to be circumcised and all that kind of thing. My question, I'm just posing the question, because I think sometimes we read this and we think, well, of course, everybody, each and every one of Abram's sons, they inherited the covenant promises. But they didn't. And the sign of circumcision is tied to the covenant promises. So then who should have carried on the sign of circumcision, it would appear from the text, are only those generations that would receive the covenant promises that had been given to Abraham.
So essentially, it was just a one-generational issue.
No.
Because after Isaac, and then Jacob, and then the 12, after that, the 12 are the group that are inheriting it.
So
So
it
all it
would
has to do is just go
continue.
to the Jacob zone, and then all people start getting it.
Not all people.
All of Jacob's descendants.
All of Jacob's descendants, and then the nation of Israel.
Yeah, which would be just Jacob's descendants.
Okay, but when you look back over culture, what you have are other than Jacob's descendants practicing circumcision.
Yes, you do.
Okay, that's my point. It would appear that somehow over time that what the sign was intended to be and what it was intended to stand for became corrupted and diluted, right? But what we see here is that they were supposed to bear a mark on their flesh. And what would that do through those 400 years that they were in servitude? It would hopefully give them hope if they had been brought into covenant, right? So what we see is that that Abraham is given the sign. In verse 15 of Genesis 17, it says, "Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she will be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, "Will a child be born to a man 100 years old, and will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." But God said, "No, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, and you will call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." Then if you drop down to verse 23, he says, "But my covenant I will establish with Isaac." Right? So, was Isaac a unique child?
Yes.
Yes. Right? He's the child of promise in the covenant and everything that that means. So, turn over to Genesis 22, because we have an interesting thing that happens in Genesis 22. Right? Years have gone on. This relationship between God and Abraham has been growing and thriving and all of those kind of things. And in Genesis 22, in verse 1, it says, "Now it came about after these things that God did what? Tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take now your son, your only son, whom you love.'" How is Isaac described here? Your only son. But who else is Abraham? Ishmael, right? He says, so what we see is that God even looks at Isaac as unique, right? He says, "Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering, and he arose and he went to the place of which God had told him. Now, how much lag time in Genesis 15 or 17, when we were just looking at that, and we looked at that passage before, how much time did Abraham spend contemplating whether or not to circumcise the males of his household in Genesis 17? None. It says, on that day, all the men of the household were circumcised. Right? How much time does it take God here to do, or take Abram to do what God tells him to do here? The next day. Okay? And he goes on, so in verse 3, and does Abraham know what God wants him to do when they get to Moriah? Yeah. Do you see any hesitancy? Do you see any question? No. He gets up. The next morning, they split the wood. He takes the fire. He takes the flint, and they head out. And it says, so on the 3rd day, Abram raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, and he laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Now, I always think this is so interesting, because as a child, I was, we had these beautiful story, Bible story books with glossy pictures, and they were so beautiful, and I would look at them all the time. And when you came to this story, Isaac in those books was portrayed as about like 5 or 6 years old. Okay? That's not how old he was. He was a teenager. Right? He's a young man. And he's carrying this wood, and his dad's carrying the knife, and he's carrying the fire. And what does Isaac ask him?
Where's the sacrifice?
Where is the sacrifice? See, they have everything that they need to do the sacrifice, but they don't have the sacrifice itself. And And he goes on, and Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father, and he said, here I am. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And what does Abraham say? The Lord God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on, and they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and he took the knife to slay who? His son. Now what's interesting, there's no mention of Isaac struggling here. There's no mention of Isaac questioning anything. Isaac is there. He has full faith in his father. And just as Abraham is about to do what God had told him to do, what happens?
Angels tells him to stop.
Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad, and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So had Abraham passed the test of friendship?
Yeah.
Big time. He had passed this test. And so when it goes on in verse 15, then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven, and he said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing, and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. Now, the question is, how did Abraham get to this place? From Genesis 12 to Genesis 22, how did Abraham get to this place that in first verse in 22, God says, okay, guess what? I want you to take Isaac. Everything that I've promised you depends on Isaac, right? I've told you, he gets everything. Ishmael, none of this covenant goes to Ishmael. It all goes to Isaac. How does Abraham get from 12, where he's talking to God, to 22, when God says, go, and I want you to sacrifice the son of which everything I promised you is going to come through? How did Abraham get there? Through living in covenant with his God, and God showing himself step after step after step after step after step. What you see here is at the beginning, there's no mention of how in Genesis 12, when you start looking at this, what he's just told is that if he goes, he'll get a land, he'll have descendants, he'll have all those things. What you see in chapter 15 is then the understanding that Eleazar will not be his descendant, but he will have a child from his own body. Ishmael is created. Then in chapter 17, God comes and he says, no, it's not going to be Ishmael. It's going to be a son that Sarah will bear to you. And then the whole question is, well, how is this going to happen? And it happens out of this miraculous grace and miracle. Isaac is a miracle child. He is truly, uniquely, and a begotten son.
Well, the other thing I've thought about a lot on this, and actually every time I read this passage I think about it, you know, he's gone from being the one that hears God say, I'm going to make all this yours, and he believes him, and God credits to him as righteousness. And then we fast forward, 20 years, and now, you know, he's being told to go and kill his only son, whom he loves. And I've thought, well, man, we have taken a big step there. So what I've figured, and I've looked here, and I've seen that this is accurate, that the periods of time between that first thing to this point here, God has interacted with him in a lot of love.
A lot of ways, a lot of time. In love, yeah.
Because you wouldn't just sacrifice your kid if you didn't love the one that was telling you to do it.
Exactly. So see, this is what I think is so interesting. This whole time from in Genesis 15, when God cuts that covenant with Abraham, how has God proven himself as a covenant partner? Faithful, true, loving, kind, all of these things. Remember that he and Abraham have an intimate friendship relationship. And what's so beautiful is we have commentary of what Abraham was thinking about this whole incident in Hebrews chapter 11. Right? So starting in verse 17, it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. Familiar language? Right? It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. He, Abraham, considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type.
Right, and he had reason to believe that,
He had
because he'd
reason
already
to
seen this
believe
stuff with Sarah. He'd already seen all these things
Yeah.
that had happened where God was just so faithful in things that there was no way for it to happen otherwise.
Exactly. Because something was going to happen on that mountain. If he killed Isaac, he would be resurrected, or God would spare him in some miraculous way, which he did with the ram. But either way, Abraham was convinced in his mind that he and Isaac were coming off of that mountain together. Now, what transpired on the top of that mountain was yet to be understood or determined. But what he knew is that he was not going to withhold his son.
Well, and that says a lot. I mean, I hate bringing this stuff back up, but it's a great rabbit trail to get off on, right? Because we don't always understand. Just like him, he didn't understand, but he knew that God would take care of him, and that directly applies to us right now.
So
Exactly.
okay, so let me ask you a question. Are you in covenant with God, those of you who are believers in this room?
The answer has to be yes.
What are you withholding from him? Is there anything in your life that you are withholding from God? And the question is, if you are, why? See, and I think this is what's so amazing about Abraham. We see this man's life, that experience after experience, not one time can he turn around and say to God, you were unfaithful in that, or you let me down. Oh my gosh, just in the number of times that he spares Sarah, his wife, from Abraham's foolishness. Until when God says, the most important person for you in your life, Abraham, is this child. I want you to sacrifice him to me. And what does Abraham do without blinking an eye?
Does it?
He doesn't. So let me ask you, in your walk with God, over the years, has he proven himself any less faithful to you than he proved himself faithful to Abraham? No. So there will come a time, it would appear, that we may be asked, and God may say to us, I want what is most precious to you. And the question is, what are you going to say? Okay? And you know what? I don't think that's a question that you can answer until it's asked. Because all of us sitting here would say,
Sure. Yes.
sure, whatever he wants. You know what? I'll give it to him. But at that moment, see, that's when that question is truly answered. Right? And this is why Abraham is the example throughout the entire Bible of what it means to be in relationship with God. So did Abraham show himself to be a faithful covenant partner?
Yes.
Yes. So what we see here is that relationship over time became reciprocal. That it wasn't just that God was doing all the heavy lifting all the time, but at some point in time there were different points when Abraham was asked to be a faithful covenant partner. One was in the act of circumcision, another was in this act of sacrificing Isaac, and Abraham is a faithful covenant partner. He decides that he will not withhold anything from his covenant partner. Okay? Now, what's interesting, though, is that this experience also gives us some understanding of what happens in Exodus 4 with Moses. Because in Exodus 4, and we've looked at this before as well, but what happens in Exodus 4 after Moses has been called by God to deliver the people? He's seen God at the burning bush. He's been told by God that he's supposed to go, and he's going to bring the people out of their slavery, that everybody who wanted to kill him before is now dead, that he can go back in safety. And we see that they take off from Midian, and so in verse 24 of chapter 4, it says, "Now it came about at the lodging place on the way that the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet, and she said, 'You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me.' So he, God, let Moses alone. At that time she said, 'You are a bridegroom of blood to me because of the circumcision.'" Now, if you don't know the backstory here, this is one of those passages that people will bring up and they'll say, how temperamental and petty is God? He's going to kill somebody over this? Okay? But why is this such an important event? Because of covenant. Now, who had obviously been circumcised, because God doesn't say anything about him not being circumcised? Moses, right? And I always think it's so interesting when you go back and you read the passage at the beginning of Exodus about his mother putting him in the basket and putting him in the Nile and all of that kind of thing, and then, the Pharaoh's daughter finds the basket, and they open the basket, and what do they say about the child in the basket? He's a Hebrew child. Have you ever asked yourself how they knew he was a Hebrew child? I mean, because, when you listen to, Charlton Heston, it's Moses, it's because, the maid who was with, the daughter, when they pull him, he was wrapped in a piece of Hebrew cloth, and she's been hiding that piece of cloth, in the arm of her robe, until the fateful moment that she could pull it out to show that he's a Hebrew and all of that kind of thing. That's not really how the text reads. They knew he was a Hebrew. And could it be that they knew he was a Hebrew because of circumcision?
It's possible, but but we also had already just talked about the fact that maybe some of these other guys.
Okay, but who was enslaved in Egypt?
Israel.
Jacob's descendants were enslaved in Egypt. So what it appears is that Moses' parents had been faithful, and he had been brought into the covenant relationship that he was supposed to be brought into. He bore that mark on his own flesh, but what had Moses failed to do for his son? To extend it. He hadn't brought his own son into the covenant relationship. So over time, it would appear that there were some things that Moses felt very passionate about as a Hebrew, like when he sees himself as the deliverer of the Hebrews, and he murders an Egyptian, and then he's, sent away and all of those kind of things. But it would appear that he didn't take circumcision that seriously. But how seriously did God take circumcision? Very seriously. Because what had God said to Abraham about any male who was not circumcised? They were not what? They were not part of the covenant. They were cut off from the covenant. And what is Moses going to do? What is he on his way to do? Rescue the children of the covenant, and he hasn't even brought his own son into the covenant. So God takes this very seriously, and Zipporah, she's the one who takes the action, and she actually ends up having God spare Moses' life and brings her own son into the covenant of Israel because she's the one who circumcises the son. Right? So was the sign of circumcision something that they could take lightly? No. And so even what you see here is that Moses wasn't at a place when he left Midian where he was willing to give whatever God called of him to give in his relationship with God yet. He hadn't reached the place that Abraham had. Now, will he as time goes on? Yes. But here, he doesn't even think enough about the covenant and what it stands for to even bring his own child into it. Right? So, is there something as covenant partners that we are going to, at some point in time, be called to give up or to have something to show that we are faithful covenant partners with God. Yeah. Right? Now, like I said, that's going to be individual to the covenant partner. Right? But each one of us, I think, at some point in time, God is going to say, do you trust me enough with this that you will hand it to me? And hopefully at that moment, what can we say?
Yes, Lord.
Carl.
So let's talk about Sarah for a minute.
Okay?
So did she know what was gonna happen?
Did Sarah know what was going to happen in relationship to what?
To Isaac. Yes. From the mountaintop. From the mountaintop.
It doesn't say that she did.
Did she know after?
See, that's an interesting question. I
Well,
think
me and
that-
Dad went on a hike and stuff got real scary.
Now, see, I think that, you know what, I believe because of just the nature of praising God and worshiping God, and because of what the author of Hebrews says, that he received him back as a type of Christ, right? I believe that Sarah was told.
Okay.
Because what did it prove about God? That he was faithful, that he had gone into covenant with Abraham, and she had been part of, and so her son was not taken from her either. Her only child wasn't taken from her. But I just believe that when God does those amazing things like that, and especially if you're a friend of God, I don't think that you can keep quiet about it.
I don't think so either, and I think she probably knew beforehand. She already was aware that God can provide miracles because she was already barren and gave a child when she was smoking old.
Yeah,
You
so
know?
Sarah,
So
yeah,
she
so
already
Sarah's,
knew.
she's already had miracles confirmed in her own life. But I think we can't apply any type of supposition to the text
Agreed.
saying that.
Agreed.
But I think that when the author of Hebrews says that he was received back as a type, then that's telling us something. And what's interesting about that is that whole passage in Hebrews about Abraham, Sarah's tied into that whole passage of faith. She's part of the faithful one as well when it talks about Sarah and Abraham. They were sojourners in the land, that they were looking for the city that was yet to be established, all these kind of things. And so I think that it would have had such an impact even in Sarah's relationship with God for Abraham to come back and say, guess what? You know, and I think, you know, Carl, it brings up a really good question because what do you think? Isaac may be the only one to voice the question, but what do you think the other two men with them are thinking as they're going?
What are we doing?
Yeah, where we have wood, we have fire, we have the knife. What we don't have is a sacrifice. And you just can't, you know, Abraham's never sacrificed, you know, lizards and snakes to God before. I don't think he's going to start now. So maybe Isaac is the one to voice the question, but maybe they were thinking it as well. What are we going to sacrifice? And see, and I think it's an interesting, I think based upon the God in his glory and his magnificence is worshipped and honored. This event on Moriah does nothing but glorify God.
Right.
And you kind of clarified one of the questions I had further on into this, that when you see Sarah's death, they're not together.
Yeah.
And I find that interesting.
See, and yeah,
And that, you know, like, okay, you tried to kill my son. I've had enough of you.
I had enough of you, I'm leaving.
And
No.
they're not together when she dies.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that
They're not
she's upset about the Isaac incident. Because see, Sarah, and I think this is something too, when you look back, Sarah had been delivered more by the hand of God than Abraham had. Sarah had been delivered when they were in Egypt. She had been delivered when they were with the Philistines. God had protected Sarah in ways that as that extension of the covenant was given to Sarah as Abraham's wife, she was part of that protective covenant that God had made with Abraham. And I don't think that was, I don't think that Sarah took that lightly. That those situations where she could have come to great harm and danger, that God had protected her. And then he had given her this miracle child. And she had allowed that child to become, and God had allowed that child to become the only heir. All of these kind of things I think that Sarah understood. So I don't think, if they did tell her when they came off the mountain, I don't think that Sarah would have said anything except, praise God. He has shown himself once again to be faithful to us. And so I don't think that we can read into it when they're not together when she dies, anything more than they're just not together when she dies. Yeah. Okay, so when you look at this then, about this covenant between God and Abraham, right? There was another covenant that we've been looking at quite a bit between David and Jonathan. So the question is does that understanding that there may be things that you are called to do in friendship to a covenant partner that you have gone into, does that extend between people? Right? And how important are covenant promises made between people when they go into these covenant relationships?
Jonathan and David is very important.
Jonathan and David. Okay, so at this example of Jonathan and David, so turn over to 1 Samuel if you want to, over to 1 Samuel 16. And we're going to be looking at some passages in 1 Samuel. Now, in 1 Samuel 16, what we're told is that God has left, his spirit has left Saul, right? And in verse 1 of chapter 16, what you see is that Samuel is grieving that God has rejected Saul. And God tells him, okay, enough of the grieving. I want you to go to Bethlehem. I've already chosen who's going to be the new king. And I want you to go to Bethlehem, and I want you to go to the house of Jesse. And Samuel shows up there, and it turns out that Jesse has a number of sons, right? And so they all parade before Samuel, and Samuel sees the first one, and he's big, and he's tall, and he's, everything that a king should be. And Samuel says, surely this is the next king of Israel. And what does God say? No, it's not. So we go through all of those sons, and each one, what does God say? No, 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 no. Until Samuel finally turns to Jesse, and he says, do you have any other sons? And what does Jesse say?
He's out.
Yeah, I've got one more. He's out tending the sheep, which was the job for the kids, right? And Samuel says, call him in, right? And we're going to wait to do the sacrifice and have this meal until he gets there. And David walks in, and what does God say? He's the one. Now, there's a statement, though, that God says to Samuel with the first son of Jesse, when Samuel is surprised that he's not the one that's going to be anointed as king. And what does God tell Samuel? Men look at the outside, but God looks at the what? The heart, right? So with that understanding, the groundwork is laid that there's something unique about David and his heart, right? And throughout the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, the statement that God uses to identify David is that he is a man after his own heart, right? So what does it mean for David to be a man after his own heart? I think it's always interesting because so many times we say about David, well, it's David's ability to be called to repentance quickly because of the incident with Bathsheba. But is there more to being a man after God's own heart than just that?
There
right?
has to be.
There has to be. So what we see is that with that incident, at the end of chapter 16, that the Spirit of God has already left Saul, and he's starting to experience these fits of rage and these fits of paranoia and all of those kind of things. And so his servants say to him, what you need is you need someone to come in and play music for you, and it will calm you down and all of these things. And one of his servants say, we know a young man who's in Bethlehem, and we can bring him, and he can come, and he can play. He's a musician. He can play, and he can soothe you. And so at the end of chapter 16, David is brought into Saul's court, right? as a musician. It also says that he was his armor bearer. But David is brought into the court. But he goes between Saul's court and back to Jesse, back and forth, right? In chapter 17, one of those times when he's back visiting Jesse, we have the incident where the Philistines have come in and they've decided instead of going to war and all of us died, fighting and many of us died, we're just going to have our two champions fight. And they say, okay, are you guys good with that? And Israel says, yep, we're good with that. And they say, okay, well, let us introduce you to our champion. And out comes Goliath. And what do the army of Israel do? We're not going to do anything with him. And what's even more interesting is, what does their king not do? He doesn't fight for Israel as well. He's in his tent moping, wondering, what are we going to do about this? No one wants to fight him. He's going to wipe us out, all of that kind of thing. And every day, Goliath and the Philistines come out and they taunt the Israelites and they make fun of the God of Israel, because those situations were as much of a battle between gods as it was the people, right? So David's home with Jesse, and Jesse says, by the way, your 3 older brothers, there was Saul, they're over there with the Philistines, I want you to take him some supplies. And David says, okay. And he gets there, and what does he hear? He hears the taunts. Now, what has he already been anointed as? The next king of Israel in chapter 16. And he comes in there, and what is his question to everybody?
Who is this Philistine that he can defy the armies of the living
Who
God?
is this uncircumcised Philistine that he thinks he has the right to sit here and taunt God and to say these things about the army of Israel and the nation of Israel?
I've thought about that a few times, though, because, he had to, yes, he's already been anointed, but there had to have been more in his life to bring him to this point than just the one anointing. He had to have had something going on where he was relating to God somehow.
He was. And that, but this is what he says. He tells Saul when Saul goes in, so he, and his brothers make a big stink about, oh, here you are, you're always making trouble, all that kind of stuff, just go home, all this kind of stuff. And he says, no. And then somebody's there and they're like, oh, this kid says he'll fight Goliath. And so they take him to Saul, and then David has to sell the idea to Saul. Remember, and David says, hey, I've killed a lion, I've killed a bear, and he talks about killing the lion, and he says, I grabbed him by the beard and I struck him. So, that takes a lot of courage to hold a lion by the head and kill it. So Saul says, okay, you go do it. And by the way, wear my armor while you're doing it. And what does David say? No, I don't want any armor. I don't want anything like that. And he goes out, and we have this beautiful exchange between David and the Philistine, and he takes that rock, and he shoots it, and he smacks Goliath between the eyes, and Goliath falls down unconscious, and David runs over there quick as he can in his youthful exuberance, and he grabs Goliath's sword, and what does he do?
Chops his head off.
Chops his head off.
It's a good way to finish it up. He's not going to come back
Yeah.
alive.
And then he takes all of his armor, his sword, everything like that, and David says, it's all mine. Now, from that point, in chapter 18, is where it starts then, because that is the moment then that we see Jonathan's heart was knit to David's. Okay? And this is what we see in chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Now, we talked about that before, but what's interesting is that Jonathan was a mighty warrior of his own prestige, right? He had done mighty things that God had led him to do, and what knit their souls together was his exuberance to defend Israel. And they see themselves as kindred spirits, and we're told that at that point, Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him, and he gave it to David. And he also, with his armor, including his sword, his bow, his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him, and he prospered, and Saul set him over the men of war. Now, we looked at that when Jonathan made that covenant with David. When he exchanged robes with him, they were exchanging identities. When they exchanged the weaponry, then Jonathan was extending his protection and his power to David. All of those things that we looked at, that those things symbolized. But they have cut a covenant, right? And so what we see here then is that David is now brought into the court of Saul. But the problem is that as Jonathan is sent out on all of these military campaigns, what do the people of Jerusalem, or the people of the capital at that time, what do they start saying when David comes back after these campaigns?
Saul's killed his hundreds.
Yeah, Saul has killed his hundreds, but David has killed his tens of thousands, right? Pat?
So did Jonathan like step down to give him like his place in the queen lines?
No, because that position that David gets is from Saul, not Jonathan. Okay? And what we see is that Jonathan, up to a certain point, is still one of the head commanders of Saul's army. But what we see here is that this growing distrust and dislike and discomfort with David, right? And we talked about that Jonathan is put in a difficult situation here because he's in covenant with David, but he's also has a loyalty to his father, right? So in chapter 18, we see it as the first time that Saul actually tries to kill David. Remember, he comes in and he's there and he says to himself he's going to pin David to the wall with his spear, but David escapes. And we're told in the next verse, in verse 12 of chapter 18, that from that time on that Saul was afraid of David.
So can you go back to 18:1 again for a second? And what are you reading out of the NAS?
Yes.
And what does yours say in 18:1? The Lord knit their souls together?
And it came about that when he had been speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David.
Okay,
And
so-
Jonathan loved him as himself.
Okay, so, and mine says, when David had finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan committed himself to David and loved him as much as he loved himself.
Exactly.
And so I guess the question is that, we talked about it a few weeks ago, what does that covenant look like? But I want to put some more legs on that. So what do we say that a covenant would look like in today? I mean, because we don't walk through the flesh.
But we do symbolically. And I think that there are certain ceremonies that you do. Marriage is one of those ceremonies. You have a group of people, you walk down the aisle, you commit, there's a vow that is spoken there, especially for believers. I mean, whether you knew it or not, honey, when we got married, you were making a vow before God. Even as an unbeliever, you may not have known it, but you were still making a vow before God that you and I would share a life, that we would be one, that you would love me above yourself, that we were knit together in the eyes of God at that moment.
Yeah, I understand that.
And so we do still have these ceremonies and these things that are covenant, but we don't explain them as covenant really that much any longer. We just talk about a marriage ceremony. Well, as a believer, maybe a better description of it would be a marriage covenant ceremony.
And that's very appropriate, but how would you, and I don't know that it even really exists in I've talked about this a lot with other men, and I don't know how it works with the women, but with men, I rarely have found where men have a lifetime friend that they love like themselves. Now, I'd love to have one. I would love to have a relationship like David and Jonathan, but I don't know of those
But
anymore.
covenant is deeper than just friendship, right? And so let's go on with this and see if it fleshes itself out for you a little bit. Okay? Because what we see here is that in these next few chapters, what we see is this situation where David understands that Saul is trying to kill him, right? And we see that at the rest of chapter 18, where he offers David his first daughter, his oldest daughter, to marry, and then he rescinds that offer and he marries her off to someone else. Well, then he offers his second daughter, who's in love with David, And David says, well, basically, I don't have the right to marry your daughter. I don't have a bride price for her. I can't pay for her. And he says, I'm a lowly man of a lowly family, and I'm poor, and I don't have the right to marry your daughter. And Saul says, you know what, that's okay. All you have to bring me are 200 Philistine foreskins. Right? Now, what's understood about that, though, I know, gross, right, Esther? It's like, ugh. It's like, but it's like, okay, but like, who's counting them? Who's in charge of the Philistines today? You know? But what's interesting is that in the passage, in verse 25, it says, Saul then said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hands of the Philistines. Right? So even this wasn't a legitimate desire on Saul's. All he wanted was to get rid of David. Well, what's interesting is that he comes back, but then at the end of chapter 18, it says that when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, his Saul's daughter, loved him, then Saul was even more afraid of David, and Saul was David's enemy continuously. Now, when you go over to chapter 19...
But hang on a second, though. So Saul says, I only need 100 foreskins. David gives him
brings him 200.
foreskins.
Yeah.
But the reality is, I mean, yes, he wanted... I wonder, going back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, again with the foreskin deal, right? Because they're not part of the covenant.
They're not part of the covenant. See, and I think this is interesting. So Saul is using something that is a sign of the covenant between the people of God, and he, in a sense, makes a mockery of it to create a situation where David's going to be killed.
Right, he could have said, I want their arms.
I want their arm, I want their head, I want something like that, I want their feet, I want their toe, their little toes. I mean, you have to get as close to a guy to, cut off his head, as you do this, But I think it's interesting, it shows how far Saul's heart was from God.
That's my point.
See, and I think that that's interesting, but he never thinks that David can accomplish it, and David will fall by the hands of the Philistine, and he won't be in a covenant relationship with David through marriage then.
Right.
See? But David does what he's asked to do. But what's interesting, the first verse in chapter 19 says, now Saul told Jonathan his son and all his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, greatly delighted in David, so Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now therefore, please be on guard in the morning and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And he tells him that I'll go and find out how Dad's feeling, and then I'll come and I'll tell you. Right? Now, why does Jonathan feel obligated to do that? Because of their covenant relationship. He has sworn to protect David. Then what we see is that Saul, he says, okay, don't worry, I won't do anything to David, because Jonathan really pricks his conscience about it. But in verse 10 David comes back into the presence of Saul, and this is where Saul tries to kill him for the second time. And then he goes to David's house to get him, and this is where David has escaped. And he flees. And so then we see at the beginning of chapter 20 that David had fled, and he fled from Naioth to Ramah, and he came and he said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity, and what is my sin before your father that he's seeking my life? And he said, far from it. You shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide this thing from me? It is not so.
See, but that right there, I had never noticed the previous verses that we were just reading, where it says Saul ordered his son Jonathan and all his servants to kill David back at the beginning of 19.
Yeah.
So at one point, he'd already told Jonathan, kill him.
Right.
Kill him.
Kill him. So
Okay.
I don't know why Jonathan's doubting him at this
Because Saul had told Jonathan he had a change of heart. And then David comes back, and Saul tries to kill him, and then he sends the troops to go capture David at his home, and David comes to Jonathan saying, no, your dad was kidding. He wasn't being honest with you. He does desire to kill me. Heidi.
So, just to back up just a little bit, I know the text doesn't say this, but what is the thinking on, so Saul said, this is the bride price, what you have to get for me. Do you think David knew he was trying to get him killed?
No. I don't think David did. I think that David always, up until chapter 20, I think David pretty much was giving Saul the benefit of the doubt each time, because you have to remember, everyone knew that Saul would have these bouts of insanity.
So maybe he didn't know he was trying to kill him. So why did David go above and beyond, sort of to boast, or?
Well,
to...
I don't think it's to boast, because I think what you see is that David saw his family as the least of the houses of Judah.
So he wasn't doing it to get back at Saul
No.
or make. Okay.
No,
You don't think so?
he's just, because this is with the first daughter. It was like, who am I that I should be married to the king's daughter?
So maybe he was trying to
I'm
prove
a-
himself.
He was proving himself, even more so that he was worthy into being married into the house of Saul. And so he goes above and beyond, because he does see himself that he's not worthy to be in the house of Saul. But I think this is so interesting, though, that in the back of his mind, what does he still have to remember about himself? At some points in time, you would think, I'm the future king, right? Because he's been anointed back in 16. So I think this even shows a humility of David as a man after God's own heart, that he knows he's the future king, but he still interacts with Saul with all the respect and dignity that he should as a man under Saul's authority, right? But Saul is bound and determined that David is going to what? He's going to die, right? So it goes on, and Jonathan says in verse 3, he says, "Yet David vowed again, saying, Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight, and he has said, Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death." Then Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you say, I will do." And so they come up with this discussion about the new moon feast and David not being there. And in verse 8 it says, "Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a covenant of the Lord with you." So then in verse 12 it says, "Then Jonathan said to David, The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness." Right? So now, who do they call in to be part of their covenant? God. Now, once this happens, it's not a covenant between two partners now. It's a covenant between three. Right? So now God is now one of the covenant partners of this. And he goes on and he says, "The Lord, the God of Israel, be witness, when I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or the third day, behold, if there is good feeling towards David, shall I not then send to you and make it known to you? If it please my father to do you harm, may the Lord do so to Jonathan, and more so, if I do not make it known to you and send you away, that you may go in safety. And may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, will you not show me the loving kindness of the Lord, that I may not die?" Now, remember, we talked about this. Why does Jonathan make that statement, "if I am still alive"? Because he's going to go talk to Saul, and Saul could very easily do what? Kill Jonathan, just for even asking about David. But he also asks David to bear kindly with him, or to treat him kindly when he comes to power. Right? And then what we see here is that, so Jonathan in verse 16 made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord require it at the hands of David's enemies." Jonathan made David vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. Then if you drop down to verse 23, "As for the agreement of which you and I have spoken, behold, the Lord is between you and me for how long? Forever." So then in verse 30, Jonathan goes and he talks to Saul. Saul accuses him of being a traitor. He says, "I know that you are in disagreement with David, and that he's going to die. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to kill him." And so David and Jonathan had created this plan with these arrows, and where these arrows would be shot, so that David could come out of hiding and David and Jonathan could speak. And so the next day, in verse 41, it says, "When the lad was gone, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground, and he bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other, and they wept together, but David wept the more. And Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he rose and he departed while Jonathan went into the city. Now, what do we see about? See, so now David and Jonathan are parting ways. Does that have any bearing on their covenant? No, it doesn't. Even though they're apart, the covenant and all of the covenant agreements are still in play, right? And what's interesting from this point on, what you see in Samuel chapter 1 is that in chapter 22, you see that David is now running for his life. You see earlier that Saul trying to find David, he kills, he has orders the death of a bunch of priests in the city of Nob. And what you see is that Saul just descends into this madness of hunting David and trying to find David. And so the question is, though, is that how does David respond to all of these things that Saul is doing? And what we see is that in chapter 22, there's an interesting statement of something that Saul has become aware of. In chapter 22, in verse 8, as he's talking, well, in verse 6 he says, "Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarask tree on the height with his spear in his hand. And all his servants were standing around him. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, 'Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush as it is this day.'" So what has Saul become completely aware of, and what did other people know about? The covenant between David and Jonathan, and now Saul thinks there's this big conspiracy around him to do this. But what we see is that Saul gathers 3,000 men to hunt down David, right? So in 1 Samuel 24, we see the first interaction between Saul and David as David's running around. And what we see is that David is being chased by Saul through the wilderness, and David and his men are hiding in a cave, and Saul comes into the cave to relieve himself. And this is, David must have been one stealthy character, because as Saul is relieving himself, David comes up behind him and cuts off a piece of his what?
Robe.
His robe. But what do all the men around him say? What do all of his, kill him now? Isn't this amazing that God has delivered your enemy into your hand? And what does David say? No. Why? He's the anointed of the Lord. With that understanding, David is confirming that there was still some kind of king relationship between David and God, and only God could remove Saul as king. David could not. Right?
Well, you need to talk about that for a minute, because I've thought about that a lot, even to the point where, all those battles that David went to up to this point, when it says he was always successful when he went out and all that. Well, I'm wondering if, he had to have some confidence knowing Samuel, he was a pretty popular guy, and, a lot of people knew about Samuel's things, so he was a man of God. And when Samuel comes to David and anoints David and says, you were the next king, you're anointed of God.
Right.
From that point on, David's got to think, well, I'm not going to die in this because I haven't been anointed as king yet. I am not the king yet. So that had to have an influence on the way he fought. That's what I think.
I think it does, because I think he fights as the king for Israel, right? But there's a very clear possibility that David will die and all of those kind of things. But I think that what you see is that he fights as the king of Israel for Israel because the king won't do it.
But then let's talk about this thing. So I don't quite really understand this, because I'd be thinking, and help me in my I've got some thought barriers here. So David has been told, he's been anointed by Samuel that he's gonna be the next king.
Right.
And then God drops Saul off, like, right there.
But
I
he's
don't-
still king. He's still king.
Yeah, but I guess the
Yeah.
question is, why would he, what's going on, and I don't think there's something you can answer, but this is something to think about. What's going on where in David's mind, he's like, this is my opportunity, this is what God wants me to do, I'm going to kill Saul because that's what, that's how I become king.
In David's thought process, only God can remove Saul from his position. David cannot as the next king. Because what that does is that brings, it brings a tarnish to David as the king who's going to reign in front of the people as the servant of God.
That makes
And
total
that's what he says, and he tells his men, Saul cannot die by my hand. And this is why his men are always, they're like, no, God's delivered him into your hand. Don't you see this as a blessing from God? And David is always like, who am I to kill the anointed of the Lord? And he tells his men at some point in time, Saul is going to have to either die in battle or someone else is going to have to do something to him, but I will not be the one to lay a hand on the anointed of the Lord, right? Because he understands that there's an agreement between God and Saul as the anointed, and there is still a reason for Saul being alive and all of this happening. So David has the incident in the cave, where then he tries to reconcile with Saul because he calls out to Saul, and then Saul has a moment of, oh, you're right, I shouldn't be this way. And what is interesting about this is that at the end of the incident in the cave, in verse 20, it says, now behold, I know that you will surely be king, and this is Saul talking to David, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. So now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's household. David swore to Saul, and Saul went to his home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So what does Saul make David promise?
Not to hurt his people.
That he will
to
not
kill them.
destroy his household,
Right.
right? So then what we see is that in chapter 26, once again, Saul comes out to get David, and he brings his 3,000 men, and Saul is laying in the middle of them, and they're all sleeping around Saul, and David and Abishai, they sneak down, and they grab Saul's spear and his water jug. And Abishai he begs David, he said, just let me take his spear and just let me stick it through him. He says, I'll pin him to the ground, I won't have to do it twice. He says, please let me kill him. And what does David say? No, we will not do anything to the anointed of the Lord. So what we see, though, is that David realizes, and this is what you see in 1 Samuel 27 in the first 4 verses, he realizes that Saul is not going to give up until he's dead. And David flees to live in Gath with the Philistines, right?
Yeah, but I don't think I'd ever read this before, but I don't think I ever saw this. It says, as the Lord lives, the Lord will certainly strike him down. Either his day will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But he will not.
But he will not die by my
All right,
hand.
well now that, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I guess
So then what we see in chapter 31 of 1 Samuel is that Saul does go out to fight the Philistines, and he dies, and so does Jonathan. Right? And so in verse 1 it says, now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. The Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the son of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and pierce me through with it, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. And Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men on that day together. And then what we see is the Philistines take the bodies, they desecrate them, they hang them from the wall, and the men of Jabesh Gilead, they go and they get the bodies, and they give them a proper burial. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, the news of this is brought to David. And the first question that David has for the person who brings it to him is, how do you know that Saul is dead? Right? And what does the man tell him? That he had killed him. Yeah. He says, I came across him. I'm a foreigner. I'm an Amalekite, but I was there at the battle. I came across Saul. He was wounded. He didn't have the courage to fall on his own sword and so I helped him and I slayed him. Now, why do you think, first of all, we have two different stories here? Okay? Why is the Amalekite story different than what the historian tells us in 1 Samuel 31?
Probably because he's trying to build himself up before David.
I would imagine so, because remember, it's interesting because this war, in a sense, between David and Saul has been going on for a number of years. And from somebody else's perspective, it would appear that David, how should he respond about hearing about the death of Saul and his 3 oldest sons?
Yippee-yi-yay.
Yeah, excited about it. Now he can take over the kingdom and he can do all of that. But how does David respond? He's heartbroken. He's heartbroken. In verse 11, it says, Then David took hold of his clothes and he tore them, and so also did all the men who were with him, and they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young men who told him, Where are you from? And he said, I am the son of an alien, an Amalekite. Then David said to him, How is it that you were not afraid to stretch out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, Go, cut him down. So he struck him and he died, and David said to him, Your blood is on your own head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed.
That seems pretty
So-
dang harsh, though. You know, I mean,
Okay.
every time I read that, I'm like, man, David, you like jumped right in there, and
Okay, but now, okay.
but even from the perspective of maybe, I mean, I'm sure that he's just coming at him showing that he's, you know, Mr. Tough Guy, not David, but like the Amalekites, like
Right.
I killed him, and David could have looked at it and said, well, you were just being compassionate because he was already dying, you know, so you were just going to help him out. But instead, he's like, no, I'm going to kill you too because you killed him, even though he was going to die.
Okay, now,
anyway.
what had David promised Saul?
Put his house.
That he would not wipe out the household of Saul. So what you see here, what is another part of the story is that Saul has one more son left. And that son has been made the king of part of the nation of Israel by Abram. So if David had responded differently, what would have happened to that son who was sitting on the throne in the north? See, he would have been up for grabs, which is what happens ultimately after a number of years of civil war. And that's what it says in 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1, that there was civil war, and there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And the house of David grew steadily stronger, and the house of Saul grew steadily weaker. Right? So David, he can't condone this man coming and saying, hey, I killed the king. Because what does that imply? That David agrees with them. That the king should be killed. Right? That the line of Saul should be wiped out. That it's not a line anymore. He's now the king. Well, I think it's because he thought, because given the political structure at that time, when one king was dead, all of his line was cut off. Because you didn't want any claims to the throne by the line of the king that had just died. So all of these people are thinking David's going to act and respond like all of the other heathen kings. Like, now remember, Saul is their first king. Israel doesn't have any kind of precedent of how you change rulers, right? This is the first time that this is happening. So David, he sets the precedent, and he has promised Jonathan that he will be kind to his household. He has promised Saul that he will not cut off his household, and this is why David acts the way that he does. It's not rash, it's not irresponsible, it's nothing. He is setting a precedent that you cannot come to with me and say that you are destroying the line of the previous king and that I'm going to condone it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to punish it. Because who are you to strike the anointed of the Lord?
I get that now. And I hadn't
Yeah.
forgotten that he'd made the covenant, and I imagine that was reigned pretty high in his brain at that
In his
point.
brain, okay?
Yeah.
And then what we see happen in 2 Samuel chapter 4 is that these two men who are working for Ishbosheth, part of his guard, they actually take it upon themselves to kill Ishbosheth, who is Saul's last son. But there's some interesting information here in verse 4, right? Now Jonathan had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled, and it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell, and he became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. Right? So we have this little thing right here. Now, what this passage doesn't tell us is that when he was 5 years old, he was taken and hidden in a horrible part of the land called Lodabar. It was a wilderness. It was a God-forsaken place. And the reason he was taken there was so David would never find him. Because he was the last heir of Saul's line. Right? So what we have in chapter 4 is Ishbosheth is killed. He's beheaded by these two men. They bring his head to David, and what do they think David's going to do? Yeah, that he's going to be happy. And it says in verse 8, they sought the head of Ishbosheth, and they brought it to David at Hebron and said to the king, behold the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my lord the king vengeance this day on Saul and his descendants. Right now, what do they not realize? That's not David's attitude, right? So David answered them, and he said to them, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, when one told me, saying, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. Now how much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, shall I now require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth? Then David commanded the young men, and they killed them, and they cut off their hands, their feet, and they hung them beside the pool in the Hebron. And they took the head of Ishbosheth, and they buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron. Right? So David is taking this decisive action of anyone. You think you can hunt down Saul's descendants and bring them to me dead? You think you're going to get a reward for that? You're not. Right? So then what we see in chapter 2 is this kingdom divided. In chapter 3, the civil war. In chapter 4, we see that finally the nation of Israel, or in chapter 5, the nation of Israel is reunited under David's reign. Right? He makes a covenant of peace with those who were following Ishbosheth and all of that. And for the next few years, David's kingdom prospers, and we see that there isn't any war, that everything, happens, and he's established. He gets Jerusalem, and it becomes his capital. But then turn over to chapter 9. Chapter 9 starts out, and it says, Then David said, Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? So after all these years, what does David still remember?
Covenant.
His covenant with Jonathan, right? He says, Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, Are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. The king said, Is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God? And Ziba said to the king, There is still a son of Jonathan who is a cripple in both feet. So the king said to him, Where is he? And Ziba said to the king, Behold, he is in the house of these people in Lodabar. Then the king David sent and brought him from Lodabar, and Mephibosheth, the son of David, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face, and he prostrated himself. And And he said, Mephibosheth, and he said, here is your servant. And David said to him, do not fear. Why is that the first thing that David says to him?
Because I'm sure he thinks he's gonna take it up.
He's the last. I mean, it's going to turn out that he has a son, but he's been hiding from who his entire life? He's been hiding from David. See, and I think what is so interesting is that the text doesn't tell us, but nobody is alive yet to correct any misinformation that Mephibosheth may have been raised with. Saul is gone, Jonathan's gone, everybody's gone. He's been hidden out in the middle of nowhere all these years, and then one day a messenger from the king comes and says, you're required to come stand before David, and what do you think Mephibosheth felt?
Oh, he's gonna kill you.
He's found me. Yeah, this is it. And so he tells him, do not fear, and then what does David tell him? He says, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly. And he prostrated himself and he said, what is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me? Now, that phrase, dead dog, is a Hebraism for an embarrassing piece of garbage. How the tables had turned, huh? And so what we see here is that David, out of his love for who? Jonathan, years later, is bound to keep that covenant promise that he had sworn to Jonathan about Jonathan's descendants in the household of David and the household of Jonathan. And not only, even though part of the covenant partnership was dead, Jonathan is dead, who is still alive and part of the partnership? God is. And so David has to be faithful to the covenant because God has been called in as part of that covenant witness to what had happened. Then the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, all that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants, and then Ziba said to the king, according to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as how? One of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, where he ate at the king's table regularly. Now he was lame in both feet. So see, covenant is deeper than just a friendship. If there are promises made in that covenant, they cannot be taken back. So when you look at David, how is David a man after God's own heart? He honors covenant. And he honors those who are in covenant. And even all these years later, I mean, Mephibosheth is a grown man now. All these years later, he honors that covenant that he had between himself and Jonathan and God. And he raises Mephibosheth up to a place of honor.
Yeah.
Now, did that cost David?
Yeah.
It did. It cost David to fulfill that. Was it unexpected that David would do that to the line of Saul?
Yes.
Yes, it was unexpected. So what you see here is that there are a lot of different levels here that you see the heart of God working in David as he fulfills this covenant promise to take care of the last two of Jonathan's household and the last two of Saul's household, Mephibosheth and his son.
Well, and it's crazy that he doesn't just give him a place as one of his own kids. He also restores to him all the land that was Saul's and gives him servants to run the place for him.
Exactly. See, this is what I'm saying. It's not a small gift that Mephibosheth is given here. It is a large gift. It is something that costs David to give this to Mephibosheth, right? So the question I think here is that how are you in covenant with the people that you have your covenant agreements with, right? How are you in your friendship to them in that sense of how willing are you to fulfill your covenant promises? Even though it may cost you something. If you have drawn God into that covenant partnership, you are bound by those covenants. And how willing are you to fulfill them? You can't not be, because who's going to judge between the covenant partners? God is. He's the witness. And he is the witness that makes sure that the covenant is acted upon. So like I said, next week we're going to start looking at the Abrahamic covenant and the Sinai covenant. So we're kind of winding up this whole looking at the rituals of covenant and the symbolism of covenant. But do you have any thoughts before we close tonight?
I think the covenant in our day could be, it's God's word, it's somebody's word, it's not to be taken lightly.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to see when we get to the new covenant. It's not to be taken lightly. And when we say things, when we walk into that new covenant, like we looked at a few weeks ago, saying, yes, I will die to self and I will live for you. Those are covenant promises that we make that God takes very seriously. And the question is, do we take them seriously? Okay? So, yeah, I think that those are important things for us to look at and evaluate in our own lives. So, yeah. So any other thoughts? Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for this time that you have given us to spend in your word tonight. And Holy Spirit, we thank you that you have once again, in your faithfulness to us, that you have taught us and guided us and shown us things that we may not have seen before. And we thank you, Holy Spirit, that you are always so faithful to teach those who have a teachable heart and a teachable mind. And so I ask tonight that these things that we have learned about the faithfulness of you, our Creator God, and what it means to be a loyal covenant partner just with you, but with one another, did not fall on deaf ears and hard hearts. That you would take the seed of this understanding and you would grow it into what it needs to be in each and every one of our lives. And we would come to that place where we would joyfully do whatever you call us to do as Abraham did. That we would come to that place where we will withhold nothing from you. That when you ask us to turn it loose, that we do so quickly and gladly, knowing that you as our covenant partner have something better for us, or that we have a promise to call on in the restoration of that. So Lord, help us to grow in our relationship with you as Abraham did, and help us to grow as David did. And let it be said of us that we are people after God's own heart. And so, Father, I just thank you for all of those who are here tonight. I thank you for their time that they have taken to come here tonight and study your word. I ask that, Father, you would just bless them this week, that you would keep them healthy, that you would keep them safe, and if it is your will, that you would bring us all back next week to continue this study. And Lord Jesus, we ask you all of these things in your name. Amen. Everyone,